A few years ago, I had the opportunity to attend a lecture by Sebastian Junger, who you might know as the writer of the books The Perfect Storm and, more recently, Tribe. He was talking about what it takes to transform reality into words on a page, and he asked us to imagine a flower. To paraphrase him, because I don't remember his exact words, he said, "There is no way that you will ever capture the absolute awe-inspiring beauty of nature. Your writing will never, ever get close to the majesty of the real world." His words stuck with me in a way that I find hard to express. As a writer, I have always struggled to capture reality and pass it on to my readers. But here, Sebastian Junger, one of my writing idols, was telling me that my mission was impossible. The very best an author can hope to achieve is a pale comparison of lived experience. But the thought is even more profound than that. Writing is not reality. At its heart, writing is a symbolic attempt to mold reality to serve a story's purpose. The real demarcation between fiction and nonfiction comes down to the liberties that we, as authors, take with our observations when telling a story. Every book that's ever been written sits on a continuum between fantasy and fact. On one end, there's peer-reviewed scientific literature that uses rigorous methodologies to remove any sort of personal bias. On the other end is the completely rich and made-up worlds of myth and legend. Here is where you might find the characters of the Marvel Universe fighting the same battles against good and evil as the ancient heroes in the Epic of Gilgamesh. But the word nonfiction is pretty strange if you think about it. It almost implies that writing and literature are first and foremost the art of making things up. The non, that little non in the beginning, makes writing about reality little more than an afterthought. I mean, we could have called it just true stuff, right? Then again, that word might also explain why so many people have told me that they love my novels. Novels, you see, are squarely in the fiction camp. I've always bristled at those comments because writing nonfiction is pretty darned hard. Fiction doesn't really have any rules, but one mistake with reality is enough to turn a work of journalism into just another fantasy. And this is where that question of truth is really important, not just because it determines where a book might end up on a store or library bookshelf, but also because it cuts to the heart of reality and imagination in the first place. We read books for different reasons, for entertainment or diversion, or to learn things about the world or ourselves. More generally, we read books because they tell us something fundamental about being alive on this earth. Even books that are made of whole cloth from an author's imagination often reveal underlying truths and human lessons. So I don't want to denigrate fiction, but I do want to underscore the different roles that each genre offers. Given all this, I've decided to put together a chart that I call the Literature Continuum, that ranks the most identifiable literature genres on a spectrum between reality and fantasy. I've also added some examples of that literature that I think typify each genre, but as a caveat, this is really a general sketch of how these genres relate to one another. I can certainly imagine a world where a work of science fiction feels more real than, say, some particular specimens of GONZO journalism. But you get the idea. Of course, I'll link to all this down there in the doobly-doo, but I'll also send it out in my newsletter, and yeah, there's a link for that down there too. But I wanted to walk you through my thinking starting where Sebastian Junger left off, objective reality, which is on the right side of my graph. The absolute closest that humans have managed to capture reality comes in the form of description of events, sort of like what you would find in a police blotter, and of course in scientific literature. If you remember Joe Friday from the series Dragnet, which incidentally doesn't fit into this category, all that cop wanted was just the facts, ma'am. This is pretty dry reading, and it sticks to just the things that everyone can agree happened, and doesn't provide any analysis at all. No one wants to read this stuff for fun. It's like a guy walked into a store at 8:32 p.m. A guy walked out of a store at 8:45 p.m. This is just bare facts. But this brings us to the next category, one that you might actually want to look at. It's a catch-all slot for newspaper journalism in general. This is not so different from the police blotter list of facts, but it provides just a little context from different sources to make sense of things. Say what you want about the problems in the news media. For the most part, it is the only and often the best way to know what is happening in the world right now that you did not directly observe. News reports should have as little bias in their reporting of facts as possible, or they start to bleed down to the left side of this chart. Ideally, this is why people say that reports from places like the Associated Press are, quote, the first draft of history, which naturally leads us to one slot to the left, to history. Once again, like fiction, this is an interesting word that breaks down to his and story, which automatically suggests that other people might have different renderings of particular events. In history, we look at the police blotter and the news sources and then start to describe connections between them in an attempt to analyze and make sense of a larger subject. A good example of this is the book Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond that examines historical and anthropological evidence to explain the spread of some types of civilizations and the decline of others. That additional analysis inserts the author's position and opinions about the world in order to craft a compelling and hopefully relevant explanation of the past. Okay, one spot over from there and we enter into a place that I am more familiar with, the world of magazine features. Unlike straight news stories, features mix on-the-ground reporting with intense analysis and storytelling, which is a strange amalgamation of facts and entertainment. Magazine features have to compel the reader with hooks and colorful imagery and compelling language. However, they are still based in fact, and places like The New Yorker, Wired, Mother Jones, and Outside Magazine all employ fact checkers to independently examine the evidence that reporters put down, to be sure that the opinions that they express can be backed up with evidence and would stand up in court against libel claims. Next to that is the world of biography and memoir, which we all understand is inherently biased. Biographies can be better, but they often depend on access to the main source, which can lead, again, to bias. Meanwhile, most memoirs are really just self-serving memories. They usually paint rosy pictures of events and can sometimes be completely fictional. However, in cases of honest effort books, such as Michelle Obama's Becoming, these can be faithful if one-sided views of history from her perspective. Still, I tend to rate those two categories as a little more, quote, real than my favorite nonfiction genre of all time, narrative nonfiction. This is where a journalist uses the storytelling techniques of fiction writers to tell a true story. Ideally, works of narrative nonfiction like Laura Hillenbrand's Unbroken read like novels, but are all based on evidence. It's often said that narrative nonfiction is the hardest genre to work in because the writer needs to balance the arc of the story with the facts as they happened. This means that the writer needs to have extensive sources, documentation, and interviews, but also that they sometimes will take liberties condensing timelines and inserting some assumptions for how things look or looked, and then recreate conversations that happened if no one has records of the exact language that was used. Most of my books fit squarely into the narrative nonfiction category, where all of the facts, I assure you, they check out. But I also put an equal effort into the storytelling. If you take a look at my most recent book, The Vortex, you'll see that I document every liberty that I take along the way so that a reader can reconstruct what really happened without taking away from the experience of the immersive storytelling. The last spot on the reality side of things is a form of journalism pioneered by the Rolling Stone writer Hunter S. Thompson in his books Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas and Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail of '72. In those books, Thompson put himself in the center of the story, along with drug-fueled hallucinations while ostensibly also committing acts of journalism along the way. Technically, this is still nonfiction because it's Thompson's own account, but the reader is really coming along for the journey, not necessarily interested in the facts. Gonzo is the perfect transition to the true middle point in our literature spectrum. The very center of this continuum is the op-ed page in any major newspaper or similar segment on mainstream television. These segments express the true and completely subjective understandings of current events, and usually those opinions take precedence over the facts themselves. Opinion pieces can be very entertaining and even useful in analyzing events and policies, but are also the tipping point between fact and fiction. Okay, now that we've crossed the literature Rubicon, we enter into the world of make-believe. These categories are even more loose than the ones for nonfiction. The first up is historical fiction. Stylistically, this can be almost the same as narrative nonfiction, where the author does intense research to understand the setting and the history, but they will either make up characters in those settings or alter historical figures to make a story more engaging. Great examples of this are the 1975 Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Killer Angels, about the Battle of Gettysburg in the American Civil War, and Ken Follett's books, notably one of my favorites, is The Pillars of the Earth, about the centuries-long process of building a cathedral. After that is the general category of novels. These are ordinary fiction books that are usually set in a world that is largely familiar, but where the author tells a made-up story, usually to make a larger point about what it's like to be human in the broadest possible sense. A great example here would be Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger, Black Boy by Richard Wright, or anything by Ernest Hemingway. Everywhere we go to the right of the novel starts to break down the fundamental nature of reality itself. It is where fiction leaves the realm of the merely made up and into the realm of the impossible. The books to the left of the novel provide increasingly colorful and impossible characters, or alter the nature of the world where those characters act, or sometimes both at the same time. And this is how we end up in the genre of magical realism. My favorite book in this genre is Bram Stoker's immortal classic, Dracula, which a lot of people would categorize as horror. Those people are, however, wrong. You can fight me in the comments, but in my opinion, horror is a subgenre of magical realism because horror only works if the subject is somehow believable. If you haven't read Dracula, you should do it right now because it is simply amazing. Stoker tells the story of the iconic vampire through a series of letters that are supposed to feel like they were written by actual people and were somehow compiled together later by a historian. It's a little like an 1800s version of the Blair Witch Project. Another example would be the movie Magnolia with Tom Cruise, where frogs suddenly and magically fall out from the sky and change the plot in a fundamental way. After magical realism is its close relative science fiction, where the author looks at how changes in technology play out in the lives of often, but not always, realistic human events. The pioneers of science fiction were people like H.G. Wells and Jules Verne, who were seeing the world change at an increasingly rapid rate and wanted to imagine what the future might look like. They conjured up underwater worlds and alien invasions as they speculated how humanity might change over time. More recent examples are Frank Herbert's Dune, about a fight over resources on a worm-infested space colony, and my recent favorite sci-fi book, Children of Time by Adrian Tchaikovsky, which looks at how the time involved with space travel could alter human evolution. Fantasy is the next tick away from reality altogether. This is a place where the characters often come out of the magical realism genre. At the same time, the very physics of the world obey different rules. Often those physics include magic. In my opinion, the best fantasy books have some rules for how that magic works in a way that at least sort of is related to physics, But that is not always the case. While the story may pull on fundamental human themes such as loyalty and the fight between good and evil in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, everything else is imagination. Some of my favorite fantasy books include Patrick Rufus's The Kingkiller Chronicle, he's got a few of those books out, and Ursula Le Guin's The Wizard of Earthsea. The very last stop on our trip out of reality is myth. It might be a little strange that myth is even less real than fantasy, in my opinion, but I put it here because when we started this talk, I noted that the word fiction underpins all writing. And it just so happens that myths are the very first type of story that humans ever told. Or at the very least, the first type to survive the ages. Myth goes back at least to the Sumerian tome, the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the purpose was to create a moral order to the universe. Myth occurs in all cultures, but they also continue to be the most popular genre in films and comic books. Today, we see new myths showing up all the time in the Marvel Universe and its seemingly infinite timelines that bear almost no reflection to real events. Myths are the ultimate fiction. They're also the most human thing that we can create as storytellers. So, you probably have opinions on where I could have improved this spectrum of literature. Did I put magical realism in the wrong spot? Should I have made separate categories for biography and memoir? Where does a book like What Doesn't Kill Us or The Wedge fit in this continuum? Let me know what you think I got right or terribly wrong down in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe and share this with other people. There is no way to get the word out about what I'm doing here on this channel without your help. So thanks.